In the spring of 1966, U.S. infantrymen stepped into the steaming, thick green wilderness of the Mekong Delta, armed with the promise of an innovation. The M16, sleek and black, had replaced the cumbersome M14. It was lighter, faster, and in theory more efficient. Its design, a sharp contrast to the heavy steel of older models, spoke to a new era of American military supremacy. It was more than just a rifle, it was a symbol of technological superiority. A weapon that promised to carry soldiers through the hellish jungles of Vietnam. But within weeks, that promise began to unravel. In the heat of battle, the M16 failed, its sleekness betraying its mechanical heart. Soldiers, fighting in the stifling humidity, found that their rifles jammed at the worst possible moments. Spent casings became lodged in chambers, bolts froze in place. The result was chaos in the heat of combat. These weren't minor malfunctions, these were life-or-death failures. At the exact moment a soldier depended on his rifle, it failed him. They were stranded, vulnerable, their weapons useless. In letters home, soldiers expressed a fear they dared not speak aloud to their commanders, the terror of relying on a rifle that could not be trusted. Yet these accounts were vague. The soldiers knew that to admit weakness in their tools would undermine their own sense of invincibility. It wasn't just the rifle that was failing. It was the myth of American technological certainty, the notion that the tools of war were as infallible as the nation that wielded them. There in the dense, suffocating humidity of Vietnam, that myth began to crack. At first, many commanders dismissed the reports as the result of poor maintenance. They claimed it was a failure of discipline, not design. It was easier to blame the soldiers than to confront the possibility that something was wrong with the weapon itself. But as the rifle continued to jam in firefights, the cracks in the narrative widened. What was initially a distant issue, the failure of an unnamed malfunction, soon became a matter of life and death. The M16, hailed as the pinnacle of modern design, had become a symbol of failure under pressure. And as it jammed in the heat of the jungle, the soldiers knew something deeper was at stake. The question remained, if the technology that promised to protect them could not be trusted, how could they trust anything at all? The answers, however, were buried deep within a complex web of design flaws, bureaucratic missteps, and military pride. And in the end, those who sought to defend the rifle would have to confront the very foundation of their belief in technological perfection. But at this moment, in the thick heat of the Mekong Delta, all they could do was fight with what they had, imperfect though it was. In a lab thousands of miles away, engineers were about to uncover what had gone wrong. But would their discoveries be enough to save the soldiers in the field? The jungle was unforgiving. The heat pressed down like an unrelenting weight, the air thick with the scent of decay and dampness. In the underbrush of Vietnam, the conflict was relentless, unpredictable, and cruel. Engagements came swiftly, like lightning strikes, sudden, fast, and dangerously close. In this brutal environment, every second counted. A malfunction, even the briefest hesitation from a weapon, could be the difference between life and death. Soldiers learned this lesson the hard way. Viet Cong ambushes were deadly in their precision, exploiting every moment of hesitation with deadly efficiency. The moment a rifle jammed, be it from faulty parts or poor maintenance, the advantage shifted instantly. A soldier's hesitation in pulling the trigger was no longer a question of survival. It was the difference between life and death. In the heart of the jungle, where time seemed to stretch endlessly, every delay became a fatal error. The sound of an unsent round was often followed by the sound of a life lost. In those moments, soldiers scrambled for solutions, improvising fixes in the mud and sweat. They jammed cleaning rods into jammed chambers, hoping to clear the weapon long enough to get a shot off. The dense humidity of the jungle became a suffocating backdrop to their desperation. There was no time for perfect maintenance, no room for careful adjustments. They had to fight with what they had, even if what they had was failing them. The stories spread quickly through the ranks, whispers in the dark corners of camp, rumors in the haze of exhaustion. The M16 was a weapon unfit for the jungle. Despite the mounting issues, many still held out hope. The M16 was a modern marvel, they told themselves. Its design was revolutionary, its potential unmatched. They believed the failures were temporary, the result of improper handling, or perhaps just a few bad batches. Commanders dismissed the concerns as a matter of discipline, their faith in American engineering too strong to be shaken by the failures of a few rye. Fles, but the evidence could no longer be ignored. The casualty reports began to show patterns, telling a different story, one that no amount of optimism could explain away. Soldiers, men they knew by name, were falling in greater numbers, and their deaths often coincided with the failure of their rifles. In the corridors of command, the reality of the situation settled in slowly, but it was undeniable. The war, unpredictable and savage, had no patience for broken weapons. It moved faster than any effort to fix the M16 could keep up with. The design flaws could not be corrected in time to save those who depended on it in the field. The war itself accelerated, its fury a reminder that the stakes were never measured by design or ingenuity, but by the ability to survive. But what they didn't know was that in the face of this crisis, a new solution was quietly taking shape. Engineers working in the shadows of the war were about to confront the very flaws that had crippled the M16, and perhaps, in doing so, would change everything. In the early months of the Vietnam War, newly issued M16 rifles arrived in the hands of U.S. soldiers, sleek and promising, a new era of military superiority. But there was a crucial oversight that would soon prove disastrous. The rifles were issued without cleaning kits. This omission, born of misplaced confidence, reflected a dangerous assumption. The Army had briefed soldiers to believe the M16 was virtually self-cleaning. It was a piece of modern engineering, they were told, a weapon that would require little maintenance in the unforgiving conditions of the jungle. But in this belief, they would soon discover their error. The humid, dense air of Vietnam, thick with moisture, became the perfect breeding ground for problems. Powder fouling, residue from the fired ammunition, built up quickly in the chambers of the rifles. In the dry heat of the desert, such issues might have been minor. But here, in the relentless moisture of the jungle, the fouling clung to every surface like wet soot, forming a grimy coating that impeded the rifle's delicate mechanisms. What was meant to be an efficient weapon became an increasingly unreliable tool. The M16, designed to be a symbol of advanced military technology, quickly revealed itself to be unprepared for the realities of war. As misfires became more frequent, soldiers found themselves resorting to whatever they could find to clean their weapons: shoelaces, strips of cloth, even wire pulled from their gear. Improvised cleaning tools became as common as their rifles themselves. Yet even the most resourceful fixes couldn't stave off the growing problem. The M16's failures became so consistent that patrols began carrying spare weapons, often scavenged from overrun Viet Cong caches. It was no longer a matter of whether the rifle would jam, but when. In combat, it was as if the soldiers had no choice but to prepare for failure. The disillusionment began to spread, a silent contagion among the ranks. For the first time, men began to trust their rifles less than they trusted the enemy. It was an unspoken truth that hovered in the air. Where once there was pride in wielding the latest and greatest technology, now there was suspicion and fear. The rifle that was supposed to modernize infantry warfare had instead become a source of quiet frustration. The discontent was not loud, nor was it overt. It was a quiet scandal, one that unfolded not in the reports of generals or in the headlines of the day, but in the subtle erosion of trust between the soldiers and their most vital tool. And in the dense jungle, amid the sound of gunfire and the rustle of leaves, this quiet scandal took root, becoming a part of the war itself. But what they didn't know was that in the wake of this failure, forces were already in motion, quietly working to right the wrongs of the M16. What they could not yet see was that the future of the rifle, and perhaps the course of the war, was about to shift in a way no one could have predicted. In the years leading up to the conflict in Vietnam, a quiet revolution was unfolding behind the walls of U.S. weapons laboratories. The military, still deeply shaped by the demands of the Cold War, sought a new kind of rifle, one that embodied the shifting tides of modern warfare. The old philosophy of firepower through mass was beginning to give way to a bold new ideal: speed over mass. The dream was simple: a lighter, faster weapon, capable of delivering deadly precision without the burden of weight. It would be a tool of efficiency, a perfect instrument of war. This dream materialized in the form of the AR-15, a prototype designed by Eugene Stoner and his team at Armalite. Unlike its predecessors, which had been heavy and cumbersome, the AR-15 was sleek, with a minimalist elegance that spoke to a new era. It fired a small, high-velocity round, the 5.56 mm cartridge, designed for accuracy over brute force. Early tests were promising. The rifle demonstrated remarkable accuracy, its recoil so mild it was almost unnoticeable. The precision of each shot seemed almost surgical, as though the rifle could hit any target with flawless efficiency. It seemed too good to be true, and for a time it was. In the corridors of the Pentagon, the M16, derived directly from the AR-15, was hailed as a revolutionary breakthrough. Its advocates spoke of a new era of infantry doctrine, one where soldiers could carry more ammunition, fire faster, and engage targets with greater confidence. In theory, the M16 was the ultimate weapon, an answer to every battlefield challenge. Its design suggested a future where American troops would wield a technological edge so advanced that it would leave their adversaries at a disadvantage. The Cold War's nuclear arms race, after all, was a testament to America's technological superiority. Why should the infantry be any different? Yet as with all dreams, there were shadows beneath the surface. Critics, particularly those with experience in the field, began to voice concerns. The 5.56 round, they argued, lacked the stopping power of the traditional .30 caliber round, which had long been the standard for infantry rifles. A small, high-velocity bullet might be accurate, but it was far less likely to incapacitate an enemy with a single shot. The debates raged, but the fervor of the rifle's advocates drowned out the critics. The future had arrived, and the Army embraced it with an enthusiasm that bordered on faith. By the time the M16 was officially adopted by the U.S. military, its design was already seen as a symbol of technological superiority. It was more than just a weapon. It was a reflection of American confidence in its ability to innovate, to dominate not just through sheer force, but through precision and efficiency. The promise of the M16 was intoxicating. Here was a weapon that could reshape the very nature of warfare, that could make soldiers faster, more accurate, and more deadly, all while lightening their load. It was a weapon of the future, a solution to problems that had not yet fully revealed themselves. In the minds of many, the M16's success was all but assured. The world had changed, and so had the rifle. The battlefield, however, would prove to be a far more unforgiving judge than the laboratory ever could be. And in the sweltering jungles of Vietnam, where the dream of the perfect rifle would be tested, there would be a reckoning. But for now, the confidence in the M16 was unshakable. The rifle had become an icon, one that symbolized both the promise of the future and the arrogance of certainty. But what the advocates of the M16 did not yet realize was that the weapon, though revolutionary in design, had a flaw that would soon begin to unravel the very foundation of their belief. It would not take long for the truth to surface. The battlefield would expose the fragility of their confidence, and the dream of a perfect rifle would begin to slip away. The decision to adopt the M16 was not solely the result of engineering prowess or military necessity. It was a decision shaped as much by politics as by design. Behind closed doors, where bureaucratic rivalries and corporate ambitions intermingled, the future of the rifle was being sealed, not by those who would wield it in battle, but by those who shaped its fate from afar. The Army's Ordnance Corps, responsible for weapons design and procurement, found itself in a tense struggle with the civilian leadership overseeing military contracts. Both sides had a stake in the M16's success, but their motivations were far from aligned. As Colt, the manufacturer of the AR-15, pressed forward with its aggressive marketing campaign, the political pressure mounted. Colt, backed by sharp salesmanship and a strategic vision, presented the M16 not just as a revolutionary weapon, but as a symbol of American innovation at the height of the Cold War. The civilian leadership, eager to project an image of technological superiority on the global stage, found Colt's pitch irresistible. To them, the M16 represented more than just a rifle. It was the future of warfare, a weapon that could redefine the American military's dominance. The message was clear. This was the weapon of the future, and it had to be embraced without delay. As the military and political brass made their decision, the urgency of the moment clouded their judgment. Production schedules raced ahead, their pace outstripping the time allotted for rigorous testing. The need for new weaponry, the pressure to modernize, and the desire to secure a technological edge all combined to push the M16 into service before it had been fully tested under combat conditions. The promise of a streamlined, efficient weapon was too tempting to pass up, even though critical questions about its readiness remained unanswered. To meet the looming deadlines and ensure that enough M16s could be supplied for deployment in Vietnam, the Army made a critical change. They replaced the original powder in the ammunition with a different, more readily available propellant. It was a move born of practicality, a way to meet supply needs without waiting for an ideal solution. But this change had unintended consequences. Ballisticians, the experts in charge of understanding the intricate physics of firearms, raised alarms. The new propellant would alter the chamber pressure, as well as the fouling characteristics of the weapon. This, they warned, could lead to increased malfunctions and diminished performance under the humid conditions of the jungle. The warnings were not ignored, but they were certainly downplayed. In the race to field the M16, the practicalities of war took precedence over the scientific concerns. The voices of the ballisticians were noted, but in the end, they were drowned out by the deafening enthusiasm for a weapon that seemed to promise everything. The decision was made. The M16 would be issued in mass quantities, and the military would adapt to any issues that arose later. It was a gamble, one that would come to define the early days of the Vietnam War. What the decision-makers didn't know was that this compromise would soon reveal itself as a fatal flaw. The M16's early malfunctions, already a source of frustration, were only the beginning. The changes to the ammunition would set in motion a series of failures that would plague soldiers in the field. As the M16's performance faltered under the unforgiving conditions of the jungle, the question would soon arise. Had the decision to field the weapon been a mistake, or was it an unavoidable consequence of the political and military pressures of the time? In the coming weeks, the consequences of this rush to mass production would become painfully clear. But at that moment, in the halls of military bureaucracy, there was still the belief that everything would work out. After all, the M16 was the rifle of the future. What could possibly go wrong? The M16 was conceived in the quiet confines of laboratories and boardrooms, where assumptions formed the backbone of its design. The engineers and military officials who signed off on it did so with a belief, one that was, in hindsight, dangerously naive. They assumed that soldiers, even in the heart of a brutal jungle war, would maintain the same level of meticulous cleaning routines that they might in a controlled garrison. The reality, of course, was far different. In the humid, oppressive conditions of Vietnam, the soldiers' primary concern was survival, not the constant maintenance of their weapons. But the designers had not foreseen this disconnect, and as a result, their assumptions would soon prove catastrophic. There were other assumptions, too, each one compounding the rifle's vulnerability. The designers assumed that the ammunition, despite the shifting sands of wartime logistics, would maintain a consistent quality. But the demands of a protracted war strained the supply chains, and the newly introduced propellant in the M16's ammunition quickly proved problematic. The Army's quick decision to change powder in order to meet production schedules had not been fully tested under the duress of combat. What they had hoped would be a minor adjustment turned out to alter the rifle's chamber pressure and fouling characteristics, compounding the malfunctions that would plague the weapon. Yet, in the face of these shifting circumstances, the belief in the rifle's superiority remained steadfast. Perhaps the most dangerous assumption of all was that the M16's tolerances could withstand the extreme conditions of the Vietnamese jungle. Early tests had been conducted in controlled environments, where the rifle could be tested in temperate conditions. The designers had not anticipated the unforgiving humidity, the constant rain, and the pervasive mud that soldiers would encounter. The rifle was not designed to cope with this kind of battlefield. It was built with the assumption that American engineering, with all its precision and innovation, could overcome the harsh realities of nature. The jungle, however, had other plans. The M16's reliability data, which had been taken from controlled firing ranges, was no substitute for the chaos of a live combat zone. No test could replicate the pace, intensity, or relentless stress that the rifle would endure in Vietnam. The weapon's manuals, once heralded as a beacon of clear instruction, understated the importance of chrome-plated chambers, a small but critical oversight. The chrome plating, which would later be adopted as a solution, was crucial to the rifle's ability to resist corrosion. But in the early days, the absence of this feature left the M16 vulnerable to the very elements that would break it down. Decision-makers, from generals to bureaucrats, were convinced that the superior design of the M16 would be enough to overcome these environmental realities. They believed that the American ingenuity that had put a man on the moon would be sufficient to prevail over the mud and humidity of the Mekong Delta. But this belief, rooted in the triumphs of technology, proved to be the weapon's most dangerous flaw. It was a fatal overestimation of what any machine could endure. As the M16 made its way into the hands of soldiers, These assumptions followed it into the field. The rifle was hailed as a new era of warfare, a technological marvel that would redefine infantry combat. But in the suffocating heat of Vietnam, where survival often came down to seconds, these assumptions began to unravel. Soldiers found themselves relying not on the promise of innovation, but on their own resourcefulness. They knew the M16 was flawed, but they had no choice but to keep fighting with it. What they didn't know, as their rifles jammed in the heat of battle, was that the foundation upon which the M16 had been built, flawed assumptions and unchecked confidence, was about to take a deadly toll. And as their trust in the weapon slowly eroded, so too would their faith in the promises of technology. The rifle that was supposed to be a symbol of American military superiority would soon become the very thing that threatened to undo that image. In the heart of the jungle, as soldiers fought to keep their rifles functional, engineers back home began to confront the cracks in the M16's design. But would their efforts be enough to restore the rifle's reliability before the damage was irreversible? The future of the weapon, and the soldiers who depended on it, hung in the balance. As the days stretched into weeks and the weeks into months, the reports from Vietnam began to paint a troubling picture. What had once been dismissed as isolated incidents soon became undeniable. The M16 was failing in the field. Combat reports grew more urgent, each one detailing another battalion, another company, another platoon crippled by the same issue: extraction failures. The rifles that had been so carefully engineered in the calm of a laboratory now refused to function in the heat of battle. The soldiers who had once trusted the rifle to protect them now found themselves in a constant battle against their own weapons. In the jungle, where every moment could be the difference between life and death, the M16's unreliability became a lethal handicap. Armorers sent to diagnose the failures struggled to find a consistent pattern. Some rifles ran clean, firing without issue, while others seized up after just a single magazine. The disparity was baffling. What made one rifle function while another faltered? Theories abounded. Some blamed the ammunition, the inconsistent quality of the newly introduced propellant. Others pointed to the heat and humidity, which had proven far more extreme than anyone had predicted. Still, others argued that the root of the issue lay in the very design of the rifle, with its tight tolerances and lack of proper coatings. In truth, all of these factors played a role, but no single answer seemed to explain it all. In an attempt to salvage what they could, teams on the ground began experimenting with different types of lubrication, hoping to slow the accumulation of fouling in the rifle's chamber. They tried oils, greases, and solvents, anything they could find to stave off the inevitable, but nothing seemed to work consistently. The M16, a rifle meant to modernize and streamline infantry warfare, had become a liability, and no amount of improvisation could change that. Each failed attempt to fix the rifle felt like a small defeat, a reminder that the soldiers were fighting not just the Viet Cong, but also the very tool they depended on for survival. Back at base, the situation grew even more desperate. Supply officers, tasked with the responsibility of equipping soldiers with the necessary tools to maintain their weapons, found themselves scrambling to request cleaning kits that had been overlooked in the initial rush to mass-produce the M16. But even when these requests were sent, the response was sluggish. Weeks, sometimes months, passed before the soldiers received the basic cleaning equipment they so desperately needed. In the meantime, the failure of the rifle continued to exact its toll. The jungle was unforgiving, and the soldiers were left to deal with a weapon that could no longer be relied upon in the most dire moments. The irony was stark. The modern army, armed with the most advanced technology of its time, found itself fighting a war not just against an enemy, but against its own weapon. The M16, designed to simplify combat and increase efficiency, had become a source of frustration and fear. Soldiers could no longer rely on the weapon to function when it mattered most. The confidence that had once accompanied its sleek, modern design had vanished, replaced by a quiet but profound distrust. In the heat of battle, where every second counted, soldiers had to adapt. They scavenged for spare weapons, often taking rifles from overrun caches. They worked with what they had, adapting in the field where bureaucracy and supply lines failed them. But no amount of ingenuity could overcome the underlying flaw of the M16, a flaw rooted in the very assumptions that had guided its design. The question now loomed large. How much longer could the M16 continue to fail before the cost became too great to bear? In the distance, back in the laboratories and boardrooms where the weapon had been conceived, the people who had championed the rifle remained confident that the issues could be resolved. But for the soldiers in the field, every misfire, every jam, every failure chipped away at their faith in the weapon and in the promises that had been made to them. And yet, as the M16 continued to falter, a quiet tension began to build. Engineers, with the failures fresh in mind, were already beginning to search for solutions. But would they be able to fix a rifle that had, for all intents and purposes, failed in its very design? The stakes were high, and the clock was ticking. The war inside the weapon was far from over. But what they didn't know was that the answer, though coming, might still be too late to change the course of history. In the weeks to come, a decision would need to be made, whether to repair the M16 or abandon it altogether in favor of something new. The future of the rifle, and perhaps of the war itself, hung in the balance. Back in the United States, the scale of the failure in Vietnam began to crystallize. As the M16's performance continued to deteriorate under the harsh conditions of the jungle, the rifles that had been returned to base began to make their way back to engineers stateside. These malfunctioning rifles, once symbols of advanced military innovation, were now little more than evidence of a design that had not lived up to its promise. Engineers, tasked with unraveling the problem, carefully examined the samples that had been shipped from Vietnam. The rifles had jammed repeatedly in the field, and the scope of the issue was growing. In labs that had once celebrated the rifle's elegant design, the disassembled M16s were now laid bare for scrutiny. Through microscopic analysis, the engineers uncovered a disturbing truth. Carbon deposits were caked thick within the rifle's chambers. The residue, a byproduct of the propellant used in the ammunition, was clogging the delicate mechanism, rendering the weapon useless at the moment it was needed most. The new powder, hastily adopted to meet the pressures of wartime production, caused far more fouling than the original powder the M16 had been designed around. What was intended to be a minor adjustment had transformed into a fatal flaw. The rifle, praised for its precision and light weight, now appeared compromised by something as simple as the consistency of its ammunition. The solution, as many engineers quickly realized, was a straightforward one: chrome plating the chambers. The shiny, corrosion-resistant surface would reduce friction, decrease fouling, and allow the rifle to function properly in the humidity and heat of Vietnam. It was a modification that made perfect sense, an elegant solution to an otherwise simple problem. Yet, as clear as the solution seemed, it was anything but easy to implement. Requests for the change were met with resistance from the very bureaucracy that had once pushed the M16 into mass production. The military's logistical system, already strained by the demands of war, was slow to respond. Production lines that had been set in motion with a great sense of urgency now faced the reality of redesign and retooling. Commanders, caught between the failing performance of the rifle and the demands of an ongoing war, were desperate for immediate results. Their soldiers were still fighting on the ground, and each failure was another risk to American lives. The pressure for a quick fix was immense, but engineers who understood the complexity of the issue requested more time. The path forward was not simple. Rushing through a solution could lead to further issues, and the engineers knew that only careful, measured adjustments would restore the M16 to the weapon it was meant to be. But in the fog of war, where seconds counted, patience was a luxury few could afford. The tension between the urgency of the battlefield and the meticulous nature of engineering innovation created a rift that would shape the M16's future. Innovation, as it turned out, would arrive slowly. For the engineers working tirelessly in their laboratories, each delayed improvement weighed heavily on them. They were haunted by the knowledge that their designs, once hailed as the pinnacle of military technology, were now failing the men they had been created to protect. Every delay, every bureaucratic hurdle was one more step away from the solution. And yet, with each passing day, they remained resolute, knowing that the answer was within their reach, but also knowing that time was not on their side. What they did not know as they labored to find the fix was that the battlefield, unyielding and unpredictable, would not wait. The soldiers in Vietnam were fighting not only against an enemy, but against their own weapon. Each malfunction, each jam, was a reminder of how fragile technological confidence could be. As the engineers worked to restore faith in the M16, the question loomed: would the solutions they developed arrive too late to turn the tide in the field? In the coming weeks, the engineers would take their first steps toward correcting the flaws in the M16. But as the rifle's failures continued to mount, Could any design changes restore the weapon's trustworthiness in time to save those who relied on it? The weight of that question would continue to press on both the men in the field and the men in the labs, each of them carrying the burden of a decision made long before the war ever began. In the jungles of Vietnam, soldiers found themselves in an uncomfortable position, a paradox that would define their relationship with the M16. The rifle, designed to be a marvel of modern engineering, was instead an instrument of constant frustration. The promise of simplicity, of a weapon that could be carried effortlessly through the field, had given way to something far less reliable. Yet, as the battlefield demanded more of them, the soldiers adapted. They adapted with a precision born not of theory, but of survival. They made it work because, in the end, they had no other choice. It began with small rituals, routines that turned into life-saving habits. Infantrymen found themselves cleaning their rifles during halts, before sleep, and even under fire. The M16, once the epitome of innovation, now required the discipline of a precision instrument, an irony lost on no one. Soldiers, often too exhausted or too frightened to consider anything else, would pause during moments of relative calm to wipe down their weapons, ensuring that they remained functional for the next firefight. They learned to anticipate malfunctions before they happened, to listen for the subtle differences in sound that preceded a jam. It became second nature, a dance of desperation and hope that only those facing death could fully understand. As the M16's failures became more frequent, soldiers began to craft their own solutions, field-expedient kits born of necessity and passed down like secret knowledge. Some were simple: a cleaning cloth tucked into a pouch, a piece of wire fashioned into a makeshift cleaning rod. Others were more complex, designed from whatever parts could be scrounged from supply caches or captured enemy weapons. These handmade kits became a form of survival, passed along from company to company, unit to unit, as each soldier learned new ways to keep their rifles functioning. It was a crude, improvised effort, but it worked, and in war, that was all that mattered. Training sergeants, those first custodians of military doctrine, were forced to rewrite the official manuals on the fly. What was once doctrine now had to be adjusted for the realities of combat. New rules emerged, not from the high commands in Washington or the bureaucrats who had rushed the M16 into service, but from the soldiers themselves. The sergeants became experts in the art of rifle maintenance in the field, teaching their men to recognize the subtle signs of a jam, to keep the chamber dry, to clean after every burst of fire. It was a desperate, reactive shift, but it was also the only way to keep the rifle running. Men who had never considered themselves mechanics or engineers now became both. The lessons shared in the field were less about tactics or strategy and more about survival. Every rifle malfunction, every misfire, was a reminder of the fragility of their existence. They learned that they could never trust the M16 to work on its own. It had to be constantly attended to, constantly watched. And so soldiers developed a bond with their rifles, not as tools, but as burdens they could not afford to drop. The urgency of these innovations was driven by a simple, undeniable truth. The M16 was no longer the instrument of war it was intended to be. The rifle, once hailed as a modern marvel, now demanded the kind of attention that only a finely tuned weapon should require. Each adaptation was born from a knowledge that could not be taught in any classroom, but was instead written in the blood and sweat of those who depended on it most. The irony was palpable. The rifle that promised to simplify combat had instead turned into a complex, unreliable instrument that needed constant care. Care that the soldiers, not the engineers, were now providing. But there was something else lurking within these adaptations. Each fix, each solution reflected a bitter truth. The soldiers were correcting the rifle, not just the misfires, the jams, or the fouling, but the very flaws that had been built into its design. They were rewriting the rules of the weapon, correcting the mistakes made in the sterile environment of boardrooms and testing ranges. The M16, which was supposed to modernize warfare, had instead become a lesson in humility, a reminder that technology, no matter how advanced, cannot escape the unpredictability of the battlefield. And so, as the war raged on, the men in the field continued to adapt. They shared their survival lessons, learned from the failures of the M16, with the kind of urgency only combat could bring. Yet, for all the innovation and improvisation, the question remained unanswered. How much longer could they keep their weapons running, and more importantly, how much longer could they trust them to protect their lives? The solution was nowhere near complete, and the stakes were growing higher by the day. What they didn't know was that the rifle they had grown to distrust would soon be redesigned in ways they could not imagine. But the question still lingered. Would these changes come in time to save them, or would the M16's failures continue to haunt them on the battlefield? By 1967, the scale of the M16's failure could no longer be ignored. The reports from Vietnam had reached a critical mass, and Washington found itself at a crossroads. What had started as a technical issue, one easily dismissed in the heat of war, had become a full-blown crisis. The M16, once a symbol of American military superiority, was now a reminder of how optimism and pride in technology could fail under the weight of real-world demands. As the malfunctions continued to pile up, the American public began to understand that the problem was not isolated, it was systemic. Congressional hearings were convened, and for the first time, the failures of the M16 were brought into the light of public scrutiny. The details that emerged were damning. The change in ammunition, made to speed up production and meet wartime demands, had altered the weapon's performance in ways that could not have been predicted. Even more troubling was the revelation that soldiers had been sent into combat without the cleaning kits essential for maintaining the M16's reliability. What was once thought to be a simple logistical oversight now appeared to be part of a much larger failure in military planning. The nation watched as the raw truths of the battlefield were laid bare in front of lawmakers and the press. Soldiers, some of them now back from the field, testified to the failures in gripping, painful detail. They spoke of the terrifying moments when the M16 jammed during decisive moments of combat, times when a single shot could have meant survival or death. Their voices, steady but heavy with the weight of their experiences, were a sharp contrast to the technological optimism that had once surrounded the rifle. "The weapon that was supposed to save us failed us," one soldier said, his words lingering in the room like a truth too stark to deny. For the first time, the American public saw not just the failures of the rifle, but the human cost of those failures. The M16's malfunction was no longer just a technical issue. It was a matter of life and death, one that had cost men their lives in the unforgiving jungles of Vietnam. The hearings forced a confrontation between technological optimism and battlefield reality. The belief in American ingenuity, that somehow the M16 could overcome the imperfections of its design, had collided head-on with the brutal truth of combat. In the laboratories, engineers had imagined a perfect weapon, one that would make American soldiers faster and more efficient. But in the muck and humidity of the battlefield, the M16 had proven to be a flawed, unreliable tool. The idealistic vision of warfare, powered by superior technology, had met the harshness of the jungle, and it had failed. This was the bitter realization that the nation had to come to terms with. No amount of American exceptionalism could erase the reality of the battlefield. As the hearings unfolded, the pressure on Washington to correct the M16's failures mounted. The voices of soldiers, now amplified by the press, demanded answers. The very foundation of military pride was at stake. In the face of this overwhelming public scrutiny, the government had no choice but to act. The urgency of wartime accelerated the process. What had once been stalled by bureaucratic red tape, design revisions, changes to ammunition, the introduction of cleaning kits, was now being fast-tracked. The public wanted solutions, and they wanted them fast. The weapon that had promised so much was now the focal point of a national reckoning, and the call for accountability had never been louder. The M16, once seen as the cutting edge of military technology, had become a symbol of the failure of that very promise. It was no longer just a weapon. It had become a national test of accountability. How could a country that prided itself on innovation and precision fail so spectacularly in something as fundamental as its infantry rifle? The consequences of this failure stretched far beyond the battlefield. It undermined trust in military leadership, in the promises of technology, and in the very systems that were supposed to protect those sent to fight. As Washington scrambled to find a solution, one thing was clear. The M16's failure would not just be measured in the lives lost, but in the lasting damage it had done to the confidence in American military superiority. In response to the growing crisis, engineers began working tirelessly to fix the flaws that had become so painfully apparent. But the question remained, would these fixes come in time to save the soldiers still on the front lines? The stakes had never been higher, and the race to restore the M16's reliability was a battle in itself. What began as a weapon of promise had become the focal point of a war for accountability, a battle not just against an enemy, but against the very technology that was supposed to protect those who fought. But what they didn't know was that the repairs being rushed through the bureaucracy would come too late to save the faith of the soldiers, who had already learned to fear the M16. As the engineers worked to fix what had been broken, they could only wonder if they could restore the trust that had been shattered. In the wake of the national reckoning over the M16, engineers and military officials in Washington began the arduous task of restoring the rifle to its intended performance. The failure of the M16 had been a bitter lesson, but one that would ultimately lead to a transformation in both design and approach. New parts began to roll off the production lines: chrome-plated chambers, redesigned buffers, and updated magazines that would, at last, give the rifle the resilience it had always lacked. These changes were no longer a matter of choice, but of necessity. The weapon, once the pinnacle of military innovation, had become a symbol of failure, a flawed design that now demanded repair piece by piece. The addition of chrome-plated chambers was perhaps the most significant of these adjustments. The plating offered the protection needed to reduce friction and resist the corrosive effects of constant exposure to humidity. Alongside this, the engineers introduced a new ammunition type, one with a cleaner burning propellant that reduced the residue that had so often clogged the rifle's chamber and led to its failure. The new ammunition, though not perfect, represented a return to the M16's original promise, a weapon capable of accuracy and reliability. As production ramped up and the new M16s began to leave the factories, the question remained: would the improvements be enough to restore the faith of the soldiers who had once trusted the rifle with their lives? To ensure the changes reached those who needed them most, cleaning kits were issued widely, their distribution an acknowledgement of the oversight that had contributed to so many malfunctions. These kits were no longer a luxury, but a necessity. Along with the kits came new training manuals, guides that emphasized the importance of maintaining the rifle in the harshest conditions. Armorers, working in combat zones and supply depots, began retrofitting thousands of M16s across active combat areas. The soldiers who had fought with rifles that failed them in the heat of battle now found themselves holding weapons that seemed to promise a second chance, if only they could believe in them again. As these changes took root, the M16 began to undergo a transformation in the field. Reliability tests, conducted in the same harsh conditions where the rifle had once failed, began to show dramatic improvement. The malfunctions that had plagued the rifle in earlier months were no longer as frequent. The soldiers, who had once turned to their handcrafted field expedients, now began to regain some confidence in their primary weapon. The M16, once feared for its failure, was slowly becoming a tool they could trust again, and with this shift came a change in morale. Soldiers who had grown disillusioned with the rifle found their confidence returning, albeit cautiously. The rifle that had once seemed a death trap was now, in many ways, a symbol of perseverance, proof that a broken system could still be repaired. But even as the M16 began to show signs of reliability, the weight of its past failures lingered. The evolution of the rifle, from the flawed tool it had been to the capable platform it was becoming, had been paid for in time and blood. The soldiers who fought with the M16 in its early days, the ones who had struggled against its malfunctions, knew that no amount of redesign could erase the scars left by the weapon's failure. For them, the M16's journey from vulnerability to reliability had come at a terrible cost, and the lessons learned in those early months were ones that could never be forgotten. The M16's rebirth was not an instant victory. It was a slow, painful process, one that demanded constant attention, vigilance, and innovation. And yet, as the rifle became more reliable, so too did the trust that had been broken between the soldiers and the weapon they depended on. It was a fragile trust, built not on flawless design, but on the knowledge that even in failure, the rifle had the potential to evolve, to be reforged. And for many soldiers, that was enough. But what they didn't know was that this evolving weapon, this newly reliable tool of war, would soon find itself tested by an enemy that was also adapting, and in ways that no one could have predicted. Would the M16's newfound reliability be enough to maintain the advantage on the battlefield, or would it soon be overshadowed by the next wave of challenges? By 1968, the M16 had undergone a profound transformation. The early struggles, the malfunctions, the doubts, these were now fading into the past as the M16A1 arrived on the front lines, a corrected, reliable successor to its troubled predecessor. This new version of the rifle, born from months of painstaking revisions, finally delivered on the promise that had been made all those years ago. The changes were not just technical, they were existential. The M16A1, once a symbol of failure, was now emerging as the backbone of American infantry in Vietnam. In the humid, oppressive heat of the monsoon season, where the air seemed to press down on the soldiers like a living thing, the rifle finally proved itself. Units across Vietnam began to report far fewer malfunctions, even in the heaviest of humidity. The chambers, now chrome-plated and resistant to corrosion, and the new ammunition, burning cleaner and leaving less residue, allowed the rifle to perform as it had been originally intended. Soldiers who had once feared their weapons now found themselves able to trust them again. Firefights that had once been marked by hesitation, those moments when a jam would seize up the rifle at the worst possible time, now unfolded with a steady, controlled rhythm. The M16A1 fired sustained, accurate bursts, its reliability transforming it from a liability into a strength on the battlefield. The improvements to the M16 were not just a technical achievement. They highlighted how preventable the original failures had been. What had seemed like insurmountable flaws, the fouling, the malfunctions, the inconsistent ammunition, were now distant memories, the product of missteps in design and oversight. The fixes that were now in place had been obvious all along, had they been properly anticipated. The reality of the rifle's earlier failures was a painful reminder that even the best-laid plans could falter under the pressure of real-world conditions. The Army, in its rush to modernize, had overlooked the simplest truths, that the harshness of the battlefield could not be ignored, and that no amount of technological optimism could change that. As the new M16A1 became more widely adopted, combat footage began to surface, showing soldiers with the rifle slung confidently over their shoulders, their movements more assured. They carried it not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of their survival, their adaptation, and their perseverance. The renewed faith in the rifle was evident in every shot fired, every burst of controlled fire that cut through the jungle, every moment when a malfunction was no longer a fear. In these images, the M16A1 seemed to be a weapon that had earned its place, forged not just in the design studios, but in the fires of combat itself. And yet, even as the M16A1 proved itself in the field, the memory of the early years lingered. It was a memory not often spoken about but carried in the eyes of the soldiers who had lived through it. The earlier years of failure, frustration, and loss remained a silent undercurrent in the confidence that now marked the rifle's performance. The jungle, once filled with the sounds of misfires, now carried a different tone. But the quiet memory of the M16's early flaws still haunted the soldiers, a caution unspoken but always present in their minds. The trust they had placed in the weapon had been shattered and rebuilt, but it would never be the same again. What was now a capable platform had been paid for in blood, and that price could never be forgotten. What the soldiers did not know was that, as they began to rely on the M16A1's new reliability, a new challenge was waiting for them, one that would test not just their weapons, but their very resolve. Could the rifle, reborn on the battlefield, continue to hold up under the unrelenting pressure of war? Or would the next phase of combat demand even more from them than they had ever imagined? In the years that followed the M16's troubled debut, veterans began to recount stories that would shape the legacy of the rifle, not in terms of innovation, but in the pain of its early failures. The accounts, passed down through battle-scarred voices, were not of grand strategic victories or heroic last stands, but of moments where the smallest malfunction led to catastrophic outcomes. A jammed rifle during an ambush, the rifle locking up in the middle of a firefight, these weren't just mechanical defects. They were moments where lives were lost. The weight of those failures could never be measured in statistics alone. They were personal, a constant reminder of the price paid when technology failed its users in the most unforgiving of environments. Letters and testimonies from soldiers flooded back home, detailing the emotional toll of fearing one's own weapon. The M16, once seen as the future of infantry combat, had turned into a source of anxiety, a thing that no longer inspired trust but instead bred a quiet, gnawing fear. Soldiers wrote of the terror of realizing that their weapon might fail them when they needed it most. In the thick of the jungle, where time moved with excruciating slowness in moments of danger, hesitation was fatal. Each jam, each malfunction felt like a betrayal. The rifle, which should have been an extension of the soldier's body, was instead a constant source of doubt, a weight they carried into every firefight, a reminder of how fragile their survival truly was. As the years passed, statisticians began to sift through casualty reports, searching for patterns that could explain the magnitude of the M16's failure. What they found was both striking and unsettling. There was a direct correlation between the zones where the M16 had been first deployed and the higher casualty rates in those areas. In places where the rifle had been rushed into service, where soldiers had received inadequate training or lacked cleaning kits, the rate of malfunction was highest, and so, too, was the rate of deaths that could be linked to those malfunctions. The numbers were stark, but the truth they conveyed was even starker. How many lives were lost not to enemy fire, but to the broken promise of a weapon that failed to function when it was most needed? The answer remained elusive, but the question haunted those who sought to understand the true cost of the M16's early failure. Historians, in their search for the causes of the war's heavy toll, would later debate the extent to which the M16's mechanical defects had contributed to the rising death count. Was it simply a matter of poor design, or had the early failures become so entrenched that they had altered the course of entire engagements? The debate, while intense, lacked any satisfying resolution. The lives lost could not be returned, nor could the consequences of those failures be undone. But what was clear, as the M16's legacy became part of the broader narrative of the war, was that its early failures were not just technical missteps. They were tragic human events, the echoes of which would ripple through the memories of soldiers long after the war ended. The rifle's early failures had become a part of its shadowed legacy, a chapter in the story of the M16 that could not be erased by redesigns or public relations campaigns. The weapon that was supposed to be the symbol of American military superiority now carried with it the weight of every soldier who had been left vulnerable by its malfunctions. And yet, as with all things in war, the full impact of those failures would only emerge slowly, in the quiet reflection of those who had lived through it. In the post-war years, as veterans returned home, they carried with them more than memories of combat. They carried the unspoken knowledge that, for all its technological advancements, the M16 had been a weapon that had tested their lives, and too often had failed them. As military institutions came to terms with the damage caused by the M16's early failures, a shift began to take place. The urgent drive to field weapons in the midst of a global conflict had been tempered by the stark lessons learned on the ground. It became clear that the military's testing procedures, often rushed and shaped by political urgency, needed to be overhauled. The painful reality of the M16's early years exposed the need for rigorous methodical testing, tests that were divorced from the pressure of wartime production schedules. It was a shift in thinking, one that would take years to fully implement, but it was a necessary one. The soldiers who had borne the brunt of the rifle's failure would, in time, see that their suffering had not been in vain. The lessons learned in the bloody jungles of Vietnam would echo through future military policy, shaping a new era of weapon development that would prioritize reliability over speed. Yet even as the military began to implement these changes, the full cost of the M16's early failure remained hidden in the silence of reflection. It was a cost borne not just in lives lost, but in trust shattered and lessons learned at an unbearable price. And as the years wore on, the true cost of the rifle's early failures, paid in both time and blood, would forever remain part of its legacy. But what they didn't know, as the lessons were slowly absorbed and changes were made, was that the M16, now reforged, would soon face its next test, a test that would push it to its limits in ways no one could have predicted. Would the rifle prove itself once and for all, or would its legacy of failure continue to haunt those who depended on it? After the chaos of Vietnam, the M16's journey seemed far from over. Its early years had been defined by frustration, failure, and an unrelenting toll on those who depended on it. But as the war ended, the rifle's story entered a new chapter, one not of immediate resolution, but of decades of painstaking refinement and restructuring. The M16, once a symbol of technological optimism gone awry, began a slow and deliberate evolution. Engineers, now aware of the platform's earlier flaws, set to work correcting its deficiencies, determined to reclaim what had been lost. The road to redemption was neither quick nor easy, but with each new iteration, the M16 began to demonstrate its potential. As the years passed, new variants of the M16 began to emerge, each one a reflection of lessons learned in the field, in laboratories, and in the hard, unforgiving environment of combat. These updated models, though far from perfect in their first years, began to gain recognition for their newfound accuracy and reliability. The early misfires were replaced by precision, the jams by sustained, dependable performance. Eventually, elite units, recognizing the potential of the reformed rifle, began to adopt further modifications. The M16, no longer the flawed tool of the past, transformed into a trusted system, a weapon capable of meeting the demands of modern warfare. Over time, the platform proved that it was not just a tool for the infantry, but a system that could be adapted and improved to meet the evolving needs of soldiers worldwide. The M16's transformation, however, was not just technical. It became a symbol of the modern American infantry. The once contested weapon, born out of technological ambition, now stood as a testament to the resilience of those who had worked to redeem it. The rifle, which had so often been a source of distrust and fear, had evolved into one of the most widely used and respected firearms in the world. It became a tool not only for the U.S. military, but for a global community of soldiers who came to rely on its accuracy and consistency. As the years went by, the early failures that had once overshadowed the M16 slowly faded from public memory, their place in history overshadowed by the rifle's later success. But for those who had fought with it during its troubled beginning, the memories lingered, quiet but persistent, like scars that never quite heal. For the veterans who had witnessed the M16's first misfires and failures in the jungles of Vietnam, its eventual success could never fully erase the bitter taste of its early flaws. The memories of faulty rifles in moments of life and death remained vivid, etched in their recollections. Though the weapon had redeemed itself in the eyes of many, it was not easily forgotten by those who had paid the price for its development. Their experience was a reminder that the cost of innovation, when tempered by arrogance or haste, could be tragically high. The M16's story became a study not just in technological progress, but in the humbling realization that innovation, no matter how bold, must always be accompanied by caution and humility. The story of the M16 is a reflection of the cost of learning too late. The rifle's early failures were not just a matter of design flaws. They were the result of miscalculations, overlooked warnings, and an eagerness to move too quickly without fully understanding the realities of the battlefield. The M16's transformation from a failure into a trusted system mirrored the painful process of learning through failure. It became, in many ways, a metaphor for the broader lessons of war. That progress is born not from unchallenged ambition, but from the willingness to confront mistakes, to adapt, and to rebuild. The road to redemption for the M16 was long and fraught with setbacks, but in the end, it became a symbol of the power of perseverance, a reminder that even the deepest failures could lead to new beginnings. But what they didn't know was that, as the M16 evolved into a symbol of reliability and modern infantry power, a new generation of weapons would soon emerge, ones that would challenge the legacy of the M16 in ways no one could yet predict. Would the M16, now redeemed, be able to hold its place in the face of the next wave of technological innovation? Or would its story become one of the past, relegated to history as yet another chapter in the ever-evolving arms race? The M16 entered the jungles of Vietnam as a promise, an ideal of modern warfare, light, efficient, and almost flawless. It was to be the weapon that would transform infantry tactics, a tool so advanced that it would give American soldiers a clear technological advantage over their adversary. This was the narrative the military had crafted, and for a time it seemed to be a perfect fit. Its sleek black silhouette promised a new era of firepower, precision, and effectiveness. But promises, as history would show, are often built on assumptions, and the M16's shortcomings would soon unravel that carefully constructed image. The rifle's failure was not just a matter of poor design or faulty engineering. It was the result of a belief that outpaced the evidence, and a confidence that outran caution. The U.S. military, driven by the urgency of the Cold War and the demands of a rapidly changing battlefield, rushed the M16 into service without the rigor needed to truly understand how it would perform under the extreme conditions of war. The early deployment of the M16 was a bold gamble, one that failed catastrophically when the rifle jammed and misfired in the heat of combat. The soldiers, sent into battle armed with the most advanced tool of its time, found themselves victims of the very ambition that had driven its creation. In moments of life and death, it was not the promise of innovation that mattered, but the reliability of the rifle at hand. And too often, that reliability was found wanting. The price of this misplaced belief was paid by those on the front lines. Soldiers who placed their trust in the M16 paid with their lives for decisions made far from the battlefield. Bureaucratic pressures, logistical missteps, and political expediency had led to a weapon that was far from ready, but it was the soldiers who had to shoulder the consequences. They fought with a tool that was, at its worst, as dangerous as it was ineffective. In some of the most harrowing battles of the war, the M16 failed its users, locking up at the exact moment when its purpose was most critical. This was not a failure of malice, but a failure of foresight, decisions made by those who could not fully comprehend the brutal, unforgiving nature of the jungle battlefield. And yet, over time, the M16 would evolve. The mistakes of its early years, paid for with blood and time, would eventually be corrected. Decades of refinement turned the once erratic rifle into one of the most enduring platforms in military history. The M16's various upgrades, the M16A1, A2, and later models, would emerge as reliable, versatile weapons, adopted by armies around the world. The innovations that had once seemed to betray the soldiers in Vietnam were refined and perfected, making the M16 a trusted tool for countless military engagements. The rifle's transformation from failure to reliability became a testament to the resilience of those who worked to fix it, and the soldiers who continued to rely on it, despite its tumultuous past. But despite its eventual success, the early years of the M16 remained a shadow in its legacy. For all its later triumphs, history remembers the failures with a quiet ache for what could have been avoided. The lessons of the M16's early years were painful ones, learned too late to spare those who fought in Vietnam. The rapid pace of technological progress had clashed with the slow, steady march of caution and thoughtful judgment. The M16 was a reminder that while technology can change quickly, the consequences of human decisions rarely do. The early mistakes, the rushed deployment, and the political pressure that drove them, these would be part of the rifle's story, part of the history that would never fade. The M16, a weapon meant to save lives, had instead become a tool that taught a harsh lesson in the value of caution and preparation. Its flaws, revealed in the heat of battle, would shape military policy for decades to come. The story of the M16 was not just one of technological advancement. It was one of accountability, of understanding that ambition must be tempered with humility. The lesson it imparted was one America would never forget, that while innovation can pave the way for the future, it is only through experience, reflection, and care that true progress is made. But what they didn't know was that even as the M16 was reshaped into a symbol of modern military success, a new generation of challenges would soon test its legacy. Would the lessons learned from its troubled past be enough to meet the demands of the future? Or would history repeat itself, this time with a different weapon and a different set of assumptions?